Thomas Coleman Younger, better known to history as Cole Younger, was born on January 15, 1844, on a family farm in Jackson County, Missouri. He was the seventh of 14 children, raised by Henry Washington Younger, successful landowner, and Bersheba Leighton Fristoe, the daughter of another well-off local farmer. Despite the blood-soaked legacy he would go on to build, Cole's beginnings were stable and respectable. He came from a large, hardworking family with strong community ties and plenty of opportunity. As he grew older, Cole stood tall and carried himself with confidence. With his auburn curls, fair skin dotted with freckles, and sharp sense of humor, he gained a reputation as something of a heartthrob. He liked to dress smartly and carried an air of polish that set him apart. For all the violence and crime he would later become known for, there was a softer, almost surprising side to him. He loved to read, enjoyed singing in church choirs, and was known for pulling harmless pranks that left people laughing rather than fuming. But the goodwill gave way to bad karma for Cole Younger in the early 1860s. Missouri, like many border states, was torn apart during the Civil War, not just by traditional armies, but by brutal backwoods skirmishes and lawless revenge killings. These guerrilla conflicts, often fought between neighbors and former friends, were some of the most vicious of the war. Cole's father, despite being a Union sympathizer, was gunned down by a Kansas Union soldier. That loss hit Cole hard, and it steered him towards a violent path. Swearing revenge, he joined the Confederate guerrilla forces, riding with William Clark Quantrill, a notorious leader of a ragtag group of bushwhackers. By 1862, conventional Confederate forces had mostly abandoned Missouri, leaving the state to irregular fighters. With no armies to protect them, towns were left at the mercy of whichever side rode in. Cole Younger's group, like many others, became locked in a bitter feud with a Kansas Union militia known as the Redlegs, infamous for their scorched earth tactics and brutality. In this lawless, blood-soaked frontier, the seeds of outlaw legend were sown. For Cole Younger, the war didn't just shape him, it carved him into something new, a man who would leave behind any pretense of ordinary life and ride headlong into the legacy of violence, vengeance, and Old West infamy. In early August 1862, as Quantrill's guerrillas prepared to strike Independence, Missouri, Cole Younger stepped forward to handle a particularly risky job, scouting the town. To avoid detection, he disguised himself as an old woman, complete with a basket of apples and side saddle riding, and passed himself off as a harmless vendor. Posing as the old granny peddler, he wandered among the Union soldiers, quietly noting their numbers and fortifications. But his espionage cover nearly slipped when he lingered too long, pretending to do some imaginary accounting. A suspicious sentry reached for his mule's reins, but quicker on the draw, Cole pulled a hidden pistol, shot the man, and rode out in the chaos. The intelligence he brought back helped Quantrill and his men take Independence 2 days later. And not long after that, Younger was promoted to first lieutenant under General Joe Shelby's command in the Confederate Army. On August 21st, 1863, Cole was back in the saddle alongside Quantrill for a far more infamous raid, one that would stain the pages of Civil War history. The target was Lawrence, Kansas, a known hotbed of abolitionist activity and Union support. The plan was methodically crafted. Multiple bands of pro-Confederate bushwhackers converged in the dead of night after riding long hours, many strapped to their saddles to avoid falling off in exhaustion. By sunrise, some 450 raiders had reached the edge of town. They descended on Lawrence swiftly and without warning. In the early chaos, the local pastor, who also served as a lieutenant in the 2nd Kansas Colored Regiment, was killed while tending to his cows. Soon after, the bushwhacking raiders stormed the Eldridge House Hotel and used it as their temporary headquarters. From there, the force split up and swept through Lawrence like a firestorm. Buildings were looted and torched. Banks, shops, and homes were ransacked. In just a few hours, over 150 men and boys were murdered in cold blood. It was not a Civil War battle. It was a massacre. The destruction wasn't random either. Quantrill's men came prepared with kill lists, aiming to exact revenge on specific political enemies. Senator James Lane, a fierce Unionist and supporter of the brutal Jayhawker raids into Missouri, was at the top. He narrowly escaped, dashing half-dressed through a cornfield. But others, they weren't so lucky. Entire families were devastated. One boy, possibly no older than 12, was shot wearing a uniform made from his father's Union jacket. Stories poured out in the aftermath of families hiding in cornfields, children kept quiet by fear, and men murdered in their own homes. The raid had lasting consequences. While Quantrill and his riders celebrated their vengeance, the raid hardened public sentiment, even among those sympathetic to the Confederate cause. And while Cole Younger participated in the attack, he later claimed he left the bushwhacker ranks soon after and enlisted in the Confederate Army proper. After the dust settled and the war ended, Cole returned to a very different Missouri. The state had shifted under the feet of returning Confederates. A new, radical-dominated constitution stripped anyone who had fought for the South of the right to vote, preach, serve on juries, or hold public office. Slavery was abolished ahead of national legislation, but so too was any hope of reintegration for thousands of ex-Confederates. What Younger found was not just a changed political landscape. It was a home that no longer felt like home. The post-war bitterness would follow him into the next phase of his life, one where the lines between outlaw and avenger blurred in the shadow of a country still healing from its own wounds. After the dust of the Civil War settled, most former Confederate guerrillas quietly returned to a normal life. Many left Missouri behind altogether, heading for more sympathetic grounds in places like Kentucky, where family and former allies made it easier to start over. Their wartime leaders, including the notorious William Bloody Bill Anderson and the aforementioned Quantrill, hadn't survived to see peace. But not all the men under their command laid down their arms. A particularly violent remnant from Anderson's crew, now following the ruthless Archie Clement, refused to give up the fight. Clement and his men didn't just stay together, they doubled down. On February 13, 1866, they pulled off what is widely considered the first armed bank robbery in broad daylight during peacetime in American history. The target was the Clay County Savings Association, a bank run by some of the most prominent citizens in the region. Just days earlier, those same men had gathered for a public meeting about the bank's affairs. Authorities were quick to act. The governor put a bounty on Clement's head, but rather than hide, Clement and his gang only got bolder, pulling off more heists the same year. On Election Day in Lexington, Missouri, Clement led his men to the polls, using threats and intimidation to ensure their preferred candidates won. Not long after, state militia moved in to restore order. When Clement refused to surrender, he was gunned down in the streets. It's unclear when the Younger brothers joined up with Clement's gang, but by 1868, Cole Younger was officially on law enforcement's radar. He was named as part of the group that robbed the Nimrod Long & Company Bank in Russellville, Kentucky. That job also included other ex-bushwhackers, like John Jarrett, who was Cole's brother-in-law, Arthur McAvoy, and the Shepherd brothers, George and Oliver. The law caught up to them quickly. Oliver was killed while resisting arrest, and George ended up behind bars. As time went on, the gang's ranks thinned. Some were captured, others went into hiding, and a few simply walked away from the outlaw life. The core, though, that remained would become legendary. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, Bob, and John, joined by Frank and Jesse James. These names would soon strike fear across the Midwest. Cole Younger, in particular, was repeatedly identified as a suspect in a series of daring robberies throughout both Missouri and Kentucky. Banks and stagecoaches were favorite targets. But by the early 1870s, a new problem arose. Banks were catching on. Security was tighter, vaults more advanced, and the risks for robbers were mounting fast. Ever pragmatic, Cole decided it was time to switch tactics. He and the rest of the gang began focusing their efforts on train robberies, where fast getaways and high-value targets promised a better return for the risk. One of these early train heists, the 1871 robbery of the Accobock Brothers Bank in Corydon, Iowa, marked a turning point as they began shifting their sights from banks to trains. Word had spread that a shipment of gold worth $75,000, a fortune at the time, was headed east out of Cheyenne on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. The gang quickly began making plans to intercept it. While Frank James and Cole Younger went to Omaha to gather details about the train schedule, Jesse James and the others took up position in the woods near the small Iowa town of Adair. On July 21, 1873, the gang put their plan into action. They removed 2 railroad spikes from the tracks along the curve near Turkey Creek, hoping to derail the train at that bend. Hidden nearby, they waited as the locomotive approached. As it hit the weakened section, the train lurched off the rails and plunged into the creek below, killing the engineer and fireman instantly and injuring several passengers. With the wrecked cars scattered, the outlaws climbed aboard, forcing a guard to open the safe, and carried out the robbery while wearing white hoods, garments that eerily resembled the masks later associated with the Ku Klux Klan. But the gang's big payday never came. That expected gold shipment of $75,000 had been delayed, and this safe held only $2,000, just a fraction of what they were after. Not to leave empty-handed, the robbers turned to the passengers, relieving them of their cash and jewelry, and pulling together another $1,000 before vanishing back to the Missouri countryside. After that, the Younger brothers' names started popping up in connection with robberies across Missouri, Kansas, Kentucky, and even as far east as West Virginia. The gang hit another train on the Iron Mountain Railroad near Gads Hill, Missouri in 1874, a bold move that finally drew the attention of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Now, the country's most relentless detectives were on their trail. Things turned deadly on March 17, 1874. 2 Pinkerton agents, Lewis Lowell and John Boyle, crossed paths with Jim and John Younger on a rural Missouri road. A gunfight broke out, and Lowell and John Younger were killed, with Boyle and Jim Younger fleeing. The agency doubled down. Another Pinkerton man, W.J. Witcher, who had already been trailing the James brothers, was found murdered along a back road in Jackson County. Authorities believed Cole Younger helped arrange the hideouts and meeting spots that allowed the gang to stay one step ahead. As pressure mounted, some members of the extended Younger family even changed their last name to Youngers, spelled with a J, in an effort to distance themselves from the growing notoriety. But the gang's ability to elude justice wasn't just about their cunning. They were protected by a network of Confederate sympathizers still bitter about the war's outcome. This underground web of supporters provided shelter, supplies, and silence, functioning in many ways like an early version of organized crime, like the Mafia. While Jesse James hogged the headlines and stirred up public sympathy through carefully crafted letters to the press, Cole Younger operated more discreetly. This allowed him to keep a lower profile, quietly guiding the gang's operations from the shadows, while Jesse became the poster boy of post-war outlaw rebellion. It was a dangerous game, but for a time, it worked. The James Younger gang stayed just out of reach, both protected and propelled by the fractured loyalties of a still divided country. In the fall of 1876, the Cole and James Younger gang made one of their boldest and most disastrous moves, an attempted robbery in the quiet town of Northfield, Minnesota. Cole and Bob Younger later explained that they had chosen this location because the bank there was tied to two men they despised, former Union generals Benjamin Butler and Adelbert Ames, both high-profile politicians during Reconstruction. The gang, still steeped in post-war bitterness, saw the heist as a strike against their old enemies in the Union cause, not just for glory and riches. On their ride northward, the outlaws passed through the small town of St. Peter, just above Mankato. There, they paused briefly, long enough to draw the attention of some curious children admiring their well-kept horses. Cole Younger, known for his soft spot for kids despite his outlaw life, lifted a 6-year-old girl onto the saddle and gave her a short ride. With a warm smile, he told her, quote, "I hope you'll always remember me." The girl, whose name was Horace Greeley Perry, named after the famous newspaperman her father admired, looked up and promised, quote, "I will always be your friend." Years later, long after Cole was captured and locked away, she kept that promise, visiting him in prison to remind him of their brief but enduring encounter. But before that reunion could happen, Cole Younger would first suffer the consequences of the gang's fateful decision in Northfield. When they arrived in the town on the 7th of September, 3 gang members entered the bank, while Cole and the others stayed outside to keep watch. Things unraveled almost immediately. The citizens of Northfield, Minnesota, weren't the passive victims the gang had hoped for. As soon as the alarm was raised, shopkeepers and townsfolk scrambled for rifles and pistols, taking up defensive positions behind barrels, windows, and doorways. Cole and his brothers fired their guns in the air, hoping to scatter the crowd, but it only hardened the townspeople's resolve. A fierce gunfight broke out in the streets, and 2 members of the gang, Clell Miller and William Chadwell, were immediately shot and killed. Bob Younger took a bullet through the arm, and another rider, Herb Potter, barely escaped as bullets tore through the air. Inside the bank, the robbery was no more successful. The acting cashier was killed, another townsman died, and the gang had to rush out, leaving empty-handed and retreating in chaos. The townspeople weren't done. Posses formed immediately, and soon hundreds of Minnesotans were tracking the outlaws. The James brothers, Frank and Jesse, managed to escape back to Missouri, but Cole, Bob, and Jim Younger weren't so lucky. Along with fellow gang member Charlie Pitts, they were cornered in a wooded ravine near the Watonwan River. In the final shootout, Pitts was killed, and the 3 younger brothers, all severely wounded, were captured in a swampy patch of land called the Hanska Slough. Cole, reflecting on their failed plan, offered a grim but honest summary. Quote, "We tried a desperate game and lost. But we are rough men used to rough ways, and we will abide by the consequences." To avoid the hangman's noose, the younger brothers pleaded guilty and were each sentenced to life behind bars. On November 18, 1876, they were locked up in the Stillwater prison in Minnesota. Meanwhile, Frank and Jesse James went underground, hiding out in Nashville, Tennessee for several years. Jesse, though, couldn't resist the lure of crime and eventually returned to it, only to be shot and killed in 1882. Frank chose a different path. He turned himself in to the governor of Missouri, and after a high-profile trial, was acquitted. He spent the rest of his life quietly, leaving behind the chaos and bloodshed of his outlaw years. But for Cole Younger, the price of one last robbery was paid in decades behind prison walls, and in the memories of those who had seen both the charm and the cruelty that defined his life. After years behind bars, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger found ways to keep their minds active while serving their time in Stillwater Prison. The three brothers pitched in money to help launch the Prison Mirror, one of the very first newspapers ever published from inside a U.S. prison. Cole took on the role of printer's apprentice, what was then called a, quote, printer's devil, and also served as the prison librarian. Their days behind bars, while harsh, were not without purpose. Some may even call it Cole Younger's real-life version of the Shawshank Redemption. But the prison years did take a toll, especially on Bob Younger, who had long suffered from the wounds sustained during the Northfield raid. Weakened and worn down, Bob Younger died in prison on September 16, 1889, from tuberculosis. Cole and Jim fared better, and with the support of the prison warden, both were granted parole on July 10, 1901. The outside world had changed, and for Jim, adjusting proved too difficult. Just over a year after his release, Jim took his own life in a St. Paul hotel room on October 19, 1902. Cole Younger, however, managed to build a second act. He published a memoir that painted himself more as a former Confederate soldier settling scores than as a legendary Old West outlaw. Alongside Frank James, he also took to the stage in a traveling Wild West extravaganza called the Cole Younger and Frank James Wild West Company, rebranding himself not as a villain, but as a piece of living frontier legend. And in a surprising twist of fate, that little girl he'd once given a ride to outside Mankato, Horace Greeley Perry, re-entered his life. Now grown, she joined Cole's show as a publicity agent and even traveled with him to Texas. A photograph taken in 1910 shows the two of them together, but after that, she seems to vanish from the historical record. In the twilight of his life, Cole turned to faith. On August 21, 1912, he announced that he had become a Christian and repented for the sins of his past. Less than a year later, on August 16, 1913, he was baptized at the Lee's Summit Christian Church. By the time Cole Younger passed away on March 21, 1916, he had somehow survived more than most men could ever imagine. Shot, hunted, imprisoned, yet he always found a way to keep going. Some called him the, quote, bandit cat, a nod to the idea that he'd used up nearly all 9 of his lives. But even legends can't outrun the Reaper forever. After escaping the Reaper's clutches 7 separate times, he died in his hometown of Lee's Summit, Missouri, and was laid to rest in the town's historic cemetery. But despite everything, Cole Younger is still forever known as the outlaw who wouldn't die.